Greetings, friends. Wanting Risky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of January 26th through February 1st of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this a thumbs up, because we are going to now start in the Zaporizhia / Dnipropetrovsk direction, specifically in this area. Now, this area has been slowed down ever since 2026 started, but it seems like the Russians are starting to put this defense line that the Ukrainians set up that ran around the Gancher River. Syriac map actually showed it with this blue line here. And once the Russians reached this line, and the Ukrainians also redeployed reinforcements here, this slowed down operations. And because the Russians had to cross a river and have to create a bridgehead with all these fortifications, it takes a little bit of a while to keep up the progress here. But it seems like there's cracks forming all along this defense line, and it seems like one of the biggest news of this week is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Ternuvate. Now, a lot of I haven't seen this personally, but a lot of sources are saying that this was I mean, we had a video. It was not just like an announcement. It was like we had Russians raising their flags all over the town here. Now, some sources are saying that was DRG activity, and there is still some consolidation to happen. That being said, regardless if it was just at the very least, this is the Ukrainians aren't in Ternuvate anymore, at least not in any sort of organized defense capacity. If there was an organized defense capacity, the Russians wouldn't be able to come out in front, be able to wave their flags and do a bunch of like videos. Usually, you only could do that once you actually have defeated the organized resistance here. So at the worst for the Russians is that there's still some consolidation to happen, but at the very least, according to Russian sources, they have completely captured Ternuvate and they are securing themselves here. Very big gain for the Russians. This also proves that the Russians have probably also reached the rail line to the south here, which is what a lot of sources are saying. We also had some geolocations of the Russians crossing from Dobropillya, trying to enter some of these fortifications that are on the other side of the Gancher River here. And so this shows that this area right here in the south of Ternuvate, up to probably the rail line right here, has been captured by the Russians, along with the town of Kostyantynivka here, which is just a small little village. So take it, regardless if there's just some consolidation that needs to happen, or if they have completely captured it, Ternuvate has fallen to the Russians, and will serve as a major focal. As you can see, it's a very big town. It's a place where the Russians could accumulate forces, and so the fall of Ternuvate is a very big gain for the Russians. And if they're able to not get dislodged from it, this will allow them to continue expanding in multiple directions. The main probably place they're going to go to is continue pushing towards the town of Dnipropetrovsk here, and probably also north here, to secure some more of these villages, just to secure their northern flank a little bit and expand their bridgehead that's been made on the northern part of the Ternuvate area in Borostovka and these kind of line of villages along the river here. The main and so yeah, I expect kind of that movement in that direction during February. So the fall turned out to a very big gain for the Russians for this week. Along with this, we had another geolocation of the Russians completely capturing the town of Dnipropetrovsk, raising their flags in this village here. So another big news for the Russians. So we've had a lot of geolocations. The Russian being Pryulufivka in Alexandro-Konstantinivka here. So it does look like the Russians have taken a bunch of the strongholds that line around the river, and the Ukrainians are using the bigger towns of formerly of Ternuvate, Voza, Donivka, Rizdonivka, Varganka Teresa, and Zaporizhia, which are a bit more further back, as like staging areas where they could put their forces so that they could counterattack the Russians that are held up in these villages that are pretty small and also on the strongholds. So and also they have a river on their back, so supply is a little bit tricky here. So it is kind of hard, but they are slowly but surely asserting themselves and creating a more stable bridgehead. So I wouldn't be surprised that from Svatopetrovka, as we saw, they're going to continue pushing towards Stara Ukrainka, Klinichnia, and reach the rail line in this direction. And then this will cut off Zaporizhia from the north. And there's been some geolocations saying, or not geolocations, but news that the Russian DRGs from Dnipropetrovsk are now entering Zaporizhia from the south, but haven't consolidated or whatnot. So it does look like the Russians have Zaporizhia in their sights. Probably they're going to try to take Krychnia and Stara Ukrainka next. And then the Russians will, try to advance, from Dnipropetrovsk to the south, and then use the forces here to advance from the north into Zaporizhia, and the capture of Zaporizhia will be also another big goal for the another big gain for the Russians. And then the fall of Zaporizhia will be the forward operating base for the Russians to move along the line of Trent. This is like a huge fortification line that goes all the way to Omelette here, and so the Russians could then attack from the side instead of directly. So this would overcome the defenses the Ukrainians built here because they are attacking from like the north and the which is not, and from the east, which is what the Ukrainians weren't expecting. And so they could probably overline these line of villages all the way to the town of Omelette, which will cut the highway, one of the main logistics hubs, to Orekhov. But they'll also move up north this way and move towards the town of Versa Teresa here. Taking this will allow them to move towards these villages right here. And then also, as you can see, this would also allow them, once the Russians also take Rizanivka, to encircle one of the main towns that the Ukrainians are using to try to do these counterattacks against Russian positions. Kostyantynivka here. Sorry, for some reason my computer glitched out. There we go. And then they could attack this from multiple angles here, take it, and then the main goal for, obviously, then the Russians will continue pushing towards the main goal of this kind of operational objective, which is to reach this new river, which is where this highway runs along, the Vernivka Teresa River here, which is where this highway runs along, and which once the Russians reach it, once they reach Omelette and so forth, they will be able to cut one of the main highways to Orekhov. So lots of good news for the Russians here. Now, the reason why I call this video kind of the beginning of a giant encirclement of Orekhov, so Orekhov is right here, is because, as you can see, there's two forces coming. As you can see, I talked about this just now, about the Russians trying to reach this highway right here. But also, there's a movement in the western part of Orekhov, which we'll talk about just now, about the Russians trying to reach basically this river, like right here, and try to, cut this highway from Orekhov as well. So there's as you can see, there's an encirclement happening with the Russians moving this way and the Russians moving this way. So as you can see, Orekhov is one of the main goals for the Russians, and the Russians need to capture this to continue moving towards the main obvious goal of this operation, which is Zaporizhia here. So now, what's happening in the west? So the biggest news is that one of the now we don't have geolocations of this, is that the Russians have announced that they've completely captured the town of Rechno right here. Now, what's odd, maybe I missed it, but I don't think I would have missed it, is that the Russians have not announced that they completely captured the town of Primorska. So that is pretty interesting. You would think they would have had to capture Primorska before they took Rechny. Maybe the Ukrainians, there's still like some holdouts in the northern part of Primorska, and this is where the Ukrainians were holding on, but they weren't really putting any troops in Rechny, so the Russians were able to bypass it and enter it, and there was really no resistance here, so they were able to take it, hence the announcement of the capture. We also got more geolocations of the Russians being in the north of Stepanhurst, showing that they have taken this city officially and are now moving getting the fields to the north of it, and such. We also had more and more geolocation of the Russians battling for these sets of villages here, which, if you look at the elevation map, shows that these line of villages are on the high ground here, which will give them allow them to overlook the highway that runs here. As you can see, this highway right here that leads towards Orekhov. Now, we had geolocation of the Russians being on the most western part of Leukemia, showing that they have indeed captured this village, and also in the eastern part of Pavlivka, showing they have indeed also captured this village. And so it seems like what the Russians were doing, kind of moving along this line of trenches here, which the Ukrainians have set up as well, because this is still close to the where the front line has been frozen for a while, and now the Russians are kind of outflanking it from the west here, and so they're kind of moving along this way and are kind of establishing themselves along these trenches here. And now the main battles are going on for the town of Nova Olenivka. Now they have announced they've captured this town. This is the biggest town in this area, and I think we had a geolocation of a Russian soldier being in this town. I forgot where though. But there is, as you can see, Syriac shows this as a gray zone. So yeah, that could be the case. Maybe they have not consolidated here yet, but it does show the Russians are the Russian sources are saying they have captured this town, and if they have captured this town, then that would basically, this was like kind of the main focal point of the defense here, and then from here it'll be no time at all before the Russians clear up the town of Molonivka and hold some positions here, and then. From here, my guess is they'll continue moving along these trenches towards Novopavlovka right here, just to continue having fortifications to hide in, and they will also move towards the town of Yurivka, Eureka, or however the fuck you pronounce it, this area. This is on the, now the thing about the Ukrainians, they have this highway that runs on the other side of the Konovka River here, so they'll have to cross the river to actually physically cut it. But if they actually take Eureka, this will allow them to be within sighting range of whatever moves here, so they'll be able to bomb a lot of things that happen. It will be basically operationally encircled if they could take the town of Eureka here. So that is the main goal for the Russians. The Russians will also continue pushing along the Konovka River, probably take Vysolinovka here, and continue, kind of having something like this. And then the main resistance for the Ukrainians will be coming from Kondonushovka, which will be the main where the Ukrainians will use them to continue trying to attack Russian positions here as they move across these fields towards here. So we shall see how that develops for the Russians. But yeah, that's the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk direction. As you can see, there's a beginning of a giant encirclement of Orekhov. And, obviously this is not going to happen. It's not like, oh, this is going to finally be finished by the end of this month. I don't think they're going to actually physically, the battle for Orekhov is not going to officially end, probably until maybe the beginning of summer. I think it will take a little bit. But it will happen sometime probably in the first half of 2026. But it's not going to happen like within this month or something. It's just, as you can see, it's starting to take shape. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Dobropillya direction, and in the Dobropillya direction, there's not been that much changes. The biggest change for the Russians in the Dobropillya is that they have announced they've completely taken the town of Toretska here, and they said the reason they were able to do that is because they were able to accumulate forces in Sofivka and cross the river and then take the village here. Now, the important thing about Toretska here is that there is two. If you look at the fortification map. There's some fortifications that are a bit more on the higher ground here, away from the river. It's not too high of a. It's just some trenches and such where the Ukraine. And so, the question is, how the Russians taking these fortifications? It's one thing to take the town, but if you want to actually take the fortifications, so that you don't want Ukrainian troops continuously being able to accumulate here and then attack into the town. So. And I don't think we had geolocation of the Russians being in Toretska. It was just an announcement, but most mappers, even neutral mappers, are saying that Toretska has fallen. So now it's just a matter of, have the Russians also taken, these trenches that are like around this area right here. So that's the question. But if they have taken it, or if they're about to take them, then it will be a very good gain for the Russians. It will be basically secure their northern flank a lot better, and it will allow them to continue. That's just another good gain for the Russians on this kind of northern flank of the Dobropillya area. And if they're able to do that, then I think they'll be in the best area to keep pushing towards Kuchov Yar and eventually Zoltoye Kolodaski. And then once they reach Zoltoye Kolodaski and capture the places they were in when they did that breakthrough, from there, my guess is they'll continue pushing along these string of villages and also kind of move across these areas. And then maybe reach this area right here, which will allow them to cut off most of the roads that connect Dnipropetrovsk from supply. So this will begin with starting to cut off a lot of roads from Dnipropetrovsk, but that's probably in the future. Probably one of the main goals for the Russians, though, is to try to encircle Dobropillya. In this case, the Russians we had geolocations of the Russians in Nova Donbass, but they have not announced the capture yet, so maybe it's like more of a gray zone. But same thing in Belitska. Now, another thing is that the Russians announced that they have completely cleared Suchoghiska here, this village right here. So maybe it just showed that maybe everything behind this line has been finally cleared. But again, we've seen this before, and the Ukrainians do have Belitska still where they could send forces. So, remember they also announced the liberation of completely Verdinsky along with this mine. So it's just a matter of the thing is that since this front is so wobbly, is that even with any sort of Ukrainian counterattack, they could re-enter Sukitska or Radinsky and then announce they're still fighting for it, even if everyone who they sent over dies. So the front line is still fluid, but it does seem like the Russians are more and more secure in their positions and are now pushing forward slowly but surely. Same thing happened in Grishny. They have taken the southern part of the town, but the center part is still being fought over, but nothing has changed this week. And then in Novopavlivka, the main thing is the Russians are still slowly but surely moving in this area. A lot of sources are saying they've advanced more in this kind of central part of the southern part of the town. I still, I think the hardest part for the Russians is that, to enter Novopavlivka, right? So maybe the Ukrainians aren't in Novopavlivka, or maybe there's not very much of them. But the thing is, there's not really any place where the everything behind Novopavlivka is just a bunch of fields. And so to move across these fields to actually enter Novopavlivka, you take a lot of losses through drones and such to try to enter it. And so once the Russians enter here, then the Russians are getting hunted by drones. So as you can see, it's very actually hard to actually take. You actually want a lot of good logistics. And as you can see, a lot of these villages around, around Novopavlivka are just like these small villages that were blown up to pieces as the Russians were advancing. So there's not really a lot of places for the Russians to like accumulate forces to move towards Novopavlivka. And so it's pretty hard to actually secure. That's why they really want to take Novopavlivka and Ivanovka, because they're not only on the other side of the tree line, they allow them to accumulate much more greater forces and then use that to advance into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So that's why the Ukrainians are fighting for these two towns very much. But it seems like the Russians are still tilting towards retaking these two towns, or not retaking, but taking these two towns. But yeah, that's the Dobropillya direction. Now we're going to also go to the Kostyantynivka direction, which actually doesn't have that much changes. The biggest change that we didn't actually have a geolocation for, though, but the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian sources are claiming, is that they have completely captured the town of Bereztuk, which I was expecting. We've been having things of Russian DRGs operating in Leninivka. We've had operations of Russians trying to circle Stepanovka. We had Russian troops entering this giant defense line on the intersection here. So it's just a big question of the fact that they weren't in Bereztuk was kind of confusing to me. But then now they have announced they've captured it, which makes total sense. I can see it. We just don't have a geolocation of it, so maybe it's they still need to consolidate. But it's something that one thing I mentioned that they're going to do, along with the Leninivka and Stepanovka. They're just slowly encircling Kostyantynivka from the west here. And then also the Russians have, most sources, even Ukrainian sources, are saying they have captured the Kostyantynivka railway right here. But besides the movement across some of these, we haven't had any more movement this week. But probably that's what the Russians are going to be continuously doing. So a lot of sources are saying right now the main Russian effort is try to moving towards the town of Dnipropetrovsk here. So they're kind of moving across from this area. And so right now Russians are operating in this area, but we don't have any geolocation of that just yet. So but this is probably where the Russians will continue advancing, though, so we shall see how that develops in the Kostyantynivka direction. But that's basically it in that direction. Alrighty. Now, in the Slavyansk direction, there's been some interesting changes here. We had another geolocation this week of the Russians being in Mikivka this week. I think we had one last week, but we had another one, them being in the center part of this village here. Now, what's very interesting is that the Russian MOD has not announced that they have taken Mikivka yet, which is very interesting. They have announced they take Pervilia, and so a lot of mappers are saying that the Russians haven't actually captured it, and they've just captured a bunch of these fields that are in front of it. But what's interesting is we also don't have any geolocation of the Russians being in Pervilia, which they have announced capture. But what we do have is we had two separate geolocations of the Russians being in Mikivka, and the Russian MOD has not announced it's captured yet. So maybe there's fierce fighting. The Ukrainians really want to hold on to it. But I do expect that Minkivka will be taken, and maybe we'll get more geolocation of Pervilia being taken. These are three villages that were kind of the frontline villages for the Ukrainians, and taking it will also allow the Russians to move towards the south, moving along kind of the canal here. So they could take this area right here. This will allow them to start reaching, moving along the canal towards the southern part of Raya Alexandrivka. And then once they clear out this area, then they'll be able to assist Russian forces advancing towards the last kind of line of defense, towards Raya Alexandrivka, mostly the town of Nikophorovka, and then these small little farm villages here near speaking of these areas, another main thing that happened is that a lot of sources are saying the Russians are consolidating in the southern part of Nikophorovka here, and they have captured the southern part of this town, and they're just going to slowly but surely just move up along this village. As you can see, Nikophorovka is actually kind of the more bigger town in this area, so capturing it will be a very big boon for the Russians. This will be where the Russians accumulate forces to try to advance towards Raya Alexandrivka, or at least and such. So, which is the main goal for the Russians in this direction. So yeah, lots of good gains for the Russians in this area. And then more further north here, a lot of sources are now saying that we talked about how the Russians took Zakitna earlier, and this week a lot of sources are saying they've actually now officially captured these hills that are to the north of or to the south of Zakitna, the capture which allows them to actually secure Zakitna, because if the Ukrainians were held in control these these hills between Zakita and Kirillovka. They've been able to do counterattacks to disrupt Russian positions in Zakitna, and the capture of these hills in the south of Zakitna allows them to actually secure this. And my guess they'll continue pushing along the river, along these hills towards Kirillovka. And they still have not announced the liberation of Orekhov yet. But I'm pretty certain that's about to happen. So once Orekhov is taken, their northern flank will be secure enough where they'll be able to move towards Kirillovka and such. And also, a lot of maps are just more and more improving positions in the south between Rizivka and Bordanovka. Taking some of these tree lines right here as well. So as you can see, there's after the fall of Seversk in the beginning mid of December, they've been advancing a lot in this area, and usually this kind of area used to be like very quiet, but now it's over the past month, the Russians have made a lot of good progress here, and so I actually wouldn't be surprised if maybe they take Alexandrivka by maybe April. I think that's a good by the end of spring's campaigning or such, maybe they'll be able to take Alexandrivka, and then the main goal probably will be Mykolaievka here. Now, speaking of when I talked about this area, let's go to the Lyman direction now. There's not actually been that much changes, but we've had a bunch of, I think we had 2 individual separate geolocation of the Russians being in these fields between, right in front of Lyman here. There's a lot of sources saying the Russians actually broke through and actually have secured themselves a bridgehead in this kind of northern part of Lyman, which makes sense because this is just residential area, so it's easier to break into. We also have mentioned before about the Russian position in the southern part of Lyman, having a small consolidation here. And so, it seems like we talked about how the battle for Lyman started because the Russians enter it, but right now it seems like they were more focusing on trying to secure their gains around. They have taken Dubrova. It seems like they've taken Orekhov, but they have not announced it yet. They've taken Yarova and such. So but the only thing left is Dobropillya. So lots of there's still some they can maybe focus on taking Dobropillya. Maybe they could focus on moving towards these forests here. Try to take these 2 villages, Stara Karavana and Busovka, which is where the Ukrainians are using from Ragnarok to unload supplies to supply their garrison in Lyman. But it does seem like the Russians are now feeling like they've cut off Lyman enough where they could start encircling it, or start entering and battling for it. But we shall see how that develops. Besides that, there's not been any other changes really in the Lyman direction. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Kupyansk direction, and this is actually the other place where there's been a lot of changes. A lot of interesting things are happening. Now the thing is, as you can tell from, I think I've mentioned this before, but I don't trust what they call the Western Military District, which is who are basically in control of the entire Oskol area, which is where the Russians are focused on. I don't really trust them. They lied really badly about Kupyansk and about taking it, and so now they've announced that they take in Kupyansk, Vozoloya, and all these and I was like, baloney, I don't believe you. It's probably over exaggerated, but it seems like someone told them that they should prove themselves, and so they actually released some videos. And it does show that at least in the eastern bank of Kupyansk, we still have a lot of interesting. It's still actually kind of confusing what's happening in the western part. The only thing we know about the western part is that the Russians there are in very bad supply situation, but they're still there. They have not been completely kicked out as I expected, but they're in a precarious situation in the western part. Now in the eastern part, they're actually making progress. And before I thought they were just kind of pulling shit out of their ass, but we had a lot of geolocations this week, and it just showed. Now, you might say, and I kind of could believe it because they've lied so much that, you might think, you might, how do you say it? It's, you might say, they just kind of sent troops there to, kind of record themselves, and then they have to hide. Maybe they have not actually officially cleared it. Who knows? But it does, one thing they showed was, there was this Russian soldier in the central part of Petropavlivka, just someone was recording him from down, it wasn't just a drone, it was someone sitting in the central part of Petropavlivka, and he was just, getting announced, he was talking, and he seemed very low-key, and everything. So it seems like, at least in the central part of Petropavlivka, they are in a very good position, along with Kucherivka, this village right here, which makes sense because the Russians have been in control of the northeastern part of Kupyansk for a little while, and if they've taken, we had another geolocation of the Russians being somewhere in Kucherivka here as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if Kucherivka and Petropavlivka have been taken. Now the big question is obviously this kind of Petropavlivka kind of like a like a snake. And so the southern part of Petropavlivka, we don't know. Like, what's the position there? My guess is they actually have taken it as well, because not only have we had geolocation in the more further south around the town of Pashana right here, we also had geolocation of the Russians being in Korolivka here. We had geolocation of the Russians being in Polonia here. We even had a geolocation in the most northern part of Kupyansk, Vosoloya, but that was, as you can see, it was them like recording from a drone a Russian hiding in a building. And so that shows that, they're obviously non-consolidated. They're not, but it does show that there is Russian DRGs actively moving all around this area. And so there's been a lot, my guess is that probably the Russians are in control of Kucherivka and Petropavlivka, and that, mostly they have kicked the Ukrainians out of Polonia and Korolivka, but maybe have not consolidated, and the Ukrainians are basically in control of Kupyansk, Volsonoye, and obviously these villages more further to the south, like Kusavarovka, Novosonovia, and so forth. But, yeah, in terms of that, I do think that what the Russians will do is continue. If I was the Russian commander, I would clear out the rest of the eastern bank of Kupyansk, just so not only and not only because it's pretty easy, because the rest of this is just residential area and they've captured like the more industrial built up area, but because if they capture the rest of the eastern part of Kupyansk, it will be easier to supply whatever garrison is left in the western part of Kupyansk. And so they could then just now, yes, there's a river. Yes, that means crossing the river will be a bit of a pain in the ass, but at least it's not like where the Russians in the center part of Kupyansk still have on their backs on the other side. They have Ukrainians here who could attack them as well. So clearing the eastern bank will be a very good boon to support the western, the forces in the western part of Kupyansk. It also allows them to then use that as a staging operation towards Kupyansk, Vosoloya. So if they could do that, clear out something like this, then I bet the next thing will be for the Russians to then focus on Kupyansk, Vosoloya, and such. So we shall see how that develops. So it looks like the Russian position in the eastern bank is a bit more better than we thought. But again, it's just a matter up in the air because the Russian positions, the Russian commanders here have lied through their teeth a lot. Along with this, we had geolocation. It looks like the Russians being in the town of Kutyivka here. We had just a geolocation of the Russians being droned right in front of it. And so, now it's just a matter of, was this just DRG activity or such? So, who knows? Maybe they finally learned that they have to expand their bridgehead here a little bit. I think before they announced, they took the town of Dnipropetrovsk here, this village right here, but maybe they got kicked out of there. But taking Kutyivka would be a very good gain for the Russians. Again, this pushes the front line further away from Dorichnia. And, if the Russians could, just capture a few of these villages here, then they'll have a big enough bridgehead where, if the Ukrainians try to accumulate another, giant attack, there's a bunch of villages they'll have to cross through before they could reach Dorichnia, instead of right now where Dorichnia is really the only thing they have secure, and it's like adjacent forest. And so, then the Ukrainians can very easily try to do a counterattack. Even it only needs a small amount of success to cut it off. So that's why, but yeah, so we shall see how that develops. So, maybe that was just DRG activity, who knows, but we shall see. Not really any changes around this area. I think I think I missed this, but I think they've captured more and more of these tree lines around Abrania. I'm kind of surprised they haven't actually taken the village itself. But yeah, they've announced they've taken more and more of these fields around this area, but nothing special in that area. Now, in the Kharkov direction, this is where actually a lot of interesting things have happened. Or at least there's been more and more biggest things happening. Last week we talked about how the Russians completely captured the town of Sumy. Even we had geolocation of the Russians being here, and this week most neutral mappers are saying also, before they announced maybe they took the more built up center part of the town, but even now even neutral mappers are saying they've taken the southern part as well. Most sources are saying they've taken the northern and central part of Kharkov, and only this kind of southern part here is left to be taken. But I do expect that probably by the end of next week, they're going to take the rest of Kharkov, and then they'll be able to have a good position with these two villages. So my main guess is the Russians will continue pushing south until they reach kind of these string of villages right here, and then from here they're probably going to then use that to then advance towards the flank of Bilokolodasky, which I think is one of the main goals. So probably what the Russians want to do is move this way so they could then maybe attack it from another direction instead of just directly. So just but in order to do this, they'll probably have to capture this giant forest. A lot of Russian sources are saying that they need to capture this forest because they're on a high ground here, and the Russians will be able. I talked about this last week, but then the Ukrainians could use these positions here to attack the Russian kind of like salient here. So maybe that's what. Maybe they'll do that. We see that the Russians are starting to be more active here. We talked about how last week how they completely recaptured the town of Zaporizhia. This week, they also announced they've completely taken the town of Zelenia, which maybe it's just maybe it's a stepping stone for a restarting of operations in this kind of area near Lipsy. Ideally for the Russians, they would retake the town of Lipsy, Visola, Ternuvate, and Rubizhenia, and then this would have a very good. These string of villages here will create a very good buffer zone and allow them to control this area around the operations to take Bilokolodasky here. So maybe if the Russians are active here, that will probably be the main goal, but we shall see how that develops. And then also they're continuing advancing in Volchansk-Kuturoya. They have taken the center part of this town, and as you can see, and it looks like only the most western part or the most eastern part of this area right here is still under Ukrainian control. So we shall see how. Maybe we're still waiting for the Russians to announce they've captured this. So far we only had geolocation of the Russians being the most eastern part, so maybe it's just a slow movement around here. But we shall see how that. So the Russians are also clearing this area. Along with this, we talked about the Russians are moving near Notiria here, so it looks like they're also putting pressure here. But yeah, that's the Kharkov direction. Lots of interesting things happening. And then in the Sumy direction, there's only been one major change this week. Usually I don't really talk about the Sumy direction because nothing happens. The main thing, we talked about how the Russians started their little movement here. They took the town of Komorovka like 2 or 3 weeks ago. This week, they announced they took in the farm of Bilobereza and the forest around this area here as well. So just some movement in this direction, but nothing much else. And then also we had geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Andriivka, which is a village right here. So we had geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Andriivka right here. So it does prove that this village has been retaken. But besides that, nothing else in this direction. Alrighty, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian career update. We are now in February. Hopefully, if you guys who want to continue receiving these weekly Russian career updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.